Hello, all you cool cats and kittens. Let's take a look at types of conflict in literature. Thank you for joining me on this ride. Okay, so types of conflict. All right, so why do we care about conflict? Okay, conflict is usually two opposing forces that are kind of battling each other out. Now, keep in mind, when I say battle, I'm not saying meaning like literally, oh my gosh, we're about to have a punch-out fight. It's just that they oppose each other. So again, without conflict, there's no plot. I could tell you a very rambling story about what I did during the day, but if there was no conflict, me not struggling against anything, you'd be like, this is the most boring story ever, Miss King. Like, please, why are you doing this to me? So it's really that I had to overcome this that helps make plot important. So we have talked or looked a tiny bit about what we call a plot diagram with our exposition, how we start, then our rising action, our climax, our falling action, and then the resolution. We'll look at that a wee bit more later, but usually during this climax part, that's kind of when the conflict really comes to a head. So we divide conflict into external or internal conflict. If it's something external, it's between the character and something outside of the character. The three main ones are man versus man, or if you want, character versus character, character versus nature, and character versus society. That's for our external. All right, so man versus man, or character versus character. Obviously, this is a character that is going against another character. Excuse me. Protagonist versus antagonist, the classic good guy versus bad guy situation. Keep in mind, again, when we say struggle, we're not necessarily mean they're coming to blows. I know we see a lot of superhero movies where, you know, it's Batman versus the Joker, and a lot of it's not just them talking things out, they're actually fighting with each other. But that's an example. Another thing to keep in mind, that technically this man versus man, it could be a family versus family. It doesn't have to be singular. So we would see this conflict in, say, Romeo and Juliet, because you've got the Capulet family that is going against the Montague family. And that conflict is kind of what causes, not kind of, it's what causes the whole play. It's why Romeo and Juliet can't be with each other. You know, why Romeo gets banished. They're fighting with each other. So again, even though it's not just one man versus another man, that would still kind of fall into that because it's one family versus another family. All right, so man versus nature. So, character struggles against a force of nature, natural disaster, desolation, animal. Anytime you see a movie with, say, a tornado, or they're having earthquakes, or volcanoes, or it's an apocalypse. The movie Armageddon, if you've ever seen that, it's probably before your time period, where Bruce Willis has to go fly to an asteroid and blow it up so it doesn't hit the earth. Okay, that's man versus nature. So I do like how it says usually the character is struggling to survive. Anytime you've ever watched a movie where the tagline is that gritty person, say it's like, one man struggling to survive, you're like, okay, this is definitely a man versus nature right there. Totally man versus nature. Honestly, in terms of man versus animal, the first thing that comes to my mind is Stephen King's Cujo, where you have people, the main character is fighting against that horrible, mean dog, Cujo. Okay, here's a goodie. Man versus society. All right, so in this one, we've got either a main character or a small group. They're going against the society, like this huge, let's say this bigger group, or the mentality or the thinking of the time. So again, it's saying fights against social traditions or rules. Usually in this, we can say, looking at bullet point 3, society becomes a character of its own. If someone is doing a man versus society, you may know some kind of individuals within that society, but in general, the society as itself is what our main characters are fighting against. One of the really big examples that we can see in this is the Hunger Games. With Katniss and everyone who's in the Hunger Games, they're fighting against the society that says it's okay to have these Hunger Games. That the Capitol is okay with pitting all the different where they live, like Zone 8, Zone 9, whatever. Another example that we saw this year is when we watched To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay, we had Atticus Finch. It was versus society, because it was society saying being like really racial and racist. So that was a man versus society. So those were all external. Now we get to internal. Okay, an internal conflict is when we struggle, or the character struggles with their own thoughts, their own way that they view themselves. So we call that man versus self. Okay, so again, this is we call it internal for a reason. You're not going to see this on the outside. It's all about changing their thoughts, or it says making a choice, choosing between right and wrong, or it may have to do with overcoming emotions or mixed feelings. Can you think of any examples? So one I like to bring up with this is if you've read The Giver. Okay, so The Giver has kind of two sorts of conflict. It has the man versus society, because you got Jonah dealing with this society that views memories and knowing about that bad things as wrong. But then you also have Jonah. He struggles with himself because, originally he is all in with the society. He is okay with it. But then over time, he has to make this choice. Like, is it okay what they're doing to the older people? Is he brave enough to try and escape? So that has a lot of man versus self. It's internal. Especially when we read stories, they're called Bildungsroman, which are basically coming of age stories, someone growing up. You're gonna see a lot of man versus self, because the very act of being a teenager is trying to become, go from being a kid to go to being an adult. So there's a lot of heavy thinking and stuff going on as people grow up and try to figure out what is the adult that I want to be. So you see a lot of right or wrong, or trying to figure out who you are. So that would all count as man versus self. So we've got 3 other types of conflict. These are more modern types, if you will, although supernatural stories. We've got Frankenstein and scary stories from the 1800s. But man versus supernatural, again, anytime they're fighting a ghost, a vampire, a baddie, spirits, aliens, monsters, okay, that's going to be man versus supernatural. Okay, man versus fate. Sometimes this can kind of look like man versus self, but it's slightly different, because it's almost sometimes like a blend of man versus self and man versus society, not for Jonah, but being able to choose your own path, basically. And then obviously one of the newer types of conflict is man versus technology. And keep in mind, we view technology as anything, a computer. That's the picture that it's showing. It has to be computer, it has to be new, it has to be shiny. But technically, technology could be any new way of doing something. So if you were back in, the 1800s, and suddenly you had the technology of a a train. So, and let's say this train, you you manage horses or something, and this train is coming along and it's displacing your way of life. Like you're going out of business renting out horses and wagons because you've got this train. So the train is technology, even though we don't think of trains as like, woohoo, fancy. But that would be a man versus technology if you're fighting against new ideas that are coming. But then again, we also have stories where it's literally like the Matrix in a way, you know, you're fighting against the machines or computers. So buttons. Okay, so those are the main types of conflict. Again, our external, man versus man, man versus society, man versus nature. Our internal is man versus self, and then we've got these nice little additional ones. So, all right. Cool, yo. Have a good one.